Herman Melville called it the watery part of the world. The Pacific Ocean covers 63 million square miles. It is deep. It is indifferent. It is a desert of water where a ship can sail for 3 months and never see land. In 1820, this ocean was the hunting ground for the most dangerous profession on Earth: whaling. We think of whaling today as a tragedy, but in 1820, it was an industry. It was the ExxonMobil of its time. The world ran on whale oil. It lit the street lamps of London. It lubricated the machines of the Industrial Revolution. It made the candles that burned on the altars of churches. Civilization was built on the blood of giants. But the men who hunted these giants were not thinking about civilization. They were thinking about the Nantucket sleigh ride, the adrenaline of being towed by an 80-ton beast in a fragile wooden boat. They were thinking about the lay, their share of the profit. And they were thinking about the rumors of rogue whales, whales that fought back, whales that didn't just flee, but calculated. This is the story of one specific ship, the Essex. It is a story that Herman Melville heard and turned into the greatest American novel, Moby Dick. But the true story is darker than the fiction. Captain Ahab had a wooden leg. The men of the Essex had something far worse. They had hunger. They had thirst. And in the end, they had a choice that would stain their souls forever. This is the story of the event that terrified a generation, the day nature stopped running and turned around to fight. Nantucket Island, a crescent of sand off the coast of Massachusetts. In 1819, this tiny island was the oil capital of the world. It was a strange place, a Quaker society, pacifist, and deeply religious on land. But at sea, they were the Iron Men. They were ruthless killers of whales. The hierarchy of Nantucket was simple. If you killed whales, you were royalty. If you didn't, you were nobody. George Pollard Jr. was royalty. He was 28 years old, the son of a famous captain. He was soft-spoken, a bit hesitant, perhaps too kind for the brutal business of command. But he had the name. And in 1819, he was given his first command, the Essex. The Essex was not a new ship. She was an old, ugly, reliable workhorse, 87 feet long. She smelled of 20 years of rancid oil and blood. She was known as a lucky ship. Pollard needed a first mate. He chose Owen Chase. Chase was 22. He was everything Pollard was not. He was aggressive, ambitious, a man with a chip on his shoulder. He wasn't from a famous family. He had to fight for everything. He wanted to be a captain so badly he could taste it. He looked at Pollard and saw a man who got the job because of his daddy. The tension between these two men, the insecure aristocrat and the aggressive upstart, would determine the fate of the crew. And then there was the boy, Thomas Nickerson, 14 years old, an orphan. This was his first voyage. He was the cabin boy. He looked at the Essex with wide eyes. To him, it was an adventure. He didn't know that he was signing up for a trip into the heart of darkness. On August the 12th, 1819, the Essex left the wharf. The Quaker women of Nantucket stood on the widows' walks, the balconies on the roofs of the houses, and watched the white sails disappear. They knew the statistics. Ships sank, whales smashed boats, men fell from the rigging. They knew some of them would not come back. The voyage began with a warning. 2 days out of port, the Essex hit the Gulf Stream. A squall line appeared on the horizon, a wall of black clouds. Captain Pollard was below decks. Owen Chase was on watch. Chase saw the squall. He underestimated it. He thought he could sail through it without shortening sail. He wanted to make good time. He wanted to prove he was fast. The wind hit the ship like a hammer. The Essex didn't just lean, she went over. The mast touched the water. The ship was on her side. "Knocked down!" the men screamed. Water poured into the hatches. The galley stove crashed through the bulkhead. The ship was drowning. Pollard scrambled up from his cabin. He managed to cut the halyards. The sails dropped. The ship groaned and righted herself, shuddering like a wounded animal. But the damage was done. They had lost 2 of their whaleboats, the small rowboats used to hunt. They had damaged the rigging. Pollard was furious, but he was also weak. He should have reprimanded Chase. He should have turned back to Nantucket to repair the boats. But Chase argued, "We can fix it at sea. We can get more boats in the Azores. If we go back, we look like failures." Pollard listened. He feared failure more than he feared the ocean. He let Chase win. They sailed on. It was the first crack in the chain of command. The first mate was leading the captain. They rounded Cape Horn in January 1820. They entered the Pacific. The Pacific was the killing grounds. It was a brutal, bloody factory. The process of whaling was medieval. When the lookout spotted a spout, there she blows. The men would drop the small whaleboats into the water. 6 men in a boat. 20 feet of cedar wood versus an 80-ton sperm whale. They would row silently until they were right on top of the beast. The harpooner would stand up. He would hurl the iron into the whale's back. Then hell would break loose. The whale would dive. The rope would spin out of the tub so fast it would smoke. If it caught your leg, it would sever it instantly. Then came the sleigh ride. The whale would drag the boat for miles until it tired. Then the mate would pick up the lance. He would stab the whale in the lungs. The whale would blow red spray, blood mixed with air. "The chimneys of fire," they would yell. Then the creature would die. For months, the Essex hunted. It was successful. They filled hundreds of barrels with oil. The ship was greasy. The men were covered in soot from the try-works, the brick oven on the deck where they boiled the blubber. But the easy whales were gone. They had fished out the coast of Chile. They heard rumors of a new ground, the offshore ground, 2,000 miles west of South America, far from any land, far from any shipping lanes. Pollard was hesitant. It was too far. Chase was eager. "That's where the big bulls are," he said. Again, Pollard gave in. On November 20th, 1820, the Essex was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, just south of the equator. It was a perfect day, clear skies, calm water. The lookout shouted, "Shoal, broad on the leeward bow." A pod of sperm whales. Pollard ordered the boats launched. 3 boats hit the water. Pollard took 1, Chase took 1. The second mate, Matthew Joy, took the 3rd. Chase harpooned a whale quickly. But the whale panicked. It thrashed its tail. It clipped Chase's boat. The planking cracked. Water rushed in. Chase had to cut the line. He stuffed a jacket into the hole and frantically rowed back to the Essex for repairs. While Pollard and Joy disappeared over the horizon chasing the pod, Chase was left alone on the Essex. He pulled his boat up on deck. He grabbed a hammer and nails. He was angry. He was missing the hunt. Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, was at the helm of the ship. He was steering the Essex. He looked out at the water. He saw something. It was a whale, but it wasn't like the others. It was a male, a bull. Sperm whales are usually 60 feet long. This one was 85. It was covered in scars. It was massive, and it wasn't fleeing. Most whales, when they hear a hammer on a ship, Chase was nailing the boat, will dive. They are terrified of sound. This whale was on the surface, facing the ship. It was spouting water. It was watching. Chase looked up. He saw the whale. He froze. "That's a big one," he muttered. The whale began to move. It didn't dive. It accelerated. It was moving straight toward the Essex. It wasn't an accident, it was a charge. The whale hit the ship just forward of the forechains. Boom! The sound was like a cannon. The 238-ton ship stopped dead in the water. The men were thrown off their feet. The whale rolled under the ship, bumping the keel, feeling the timber. Chase couldn't believe his eyes. A whale attacking a ship? It was unheard of. "Pumps!" he yelled. "Rig the pumps!" The whale surfaced on the other side. It appeared stunned. It lay still for a moment, shaking its massive head. Chase thought about harpooning it. He had a lance in his hand, but the whale was too close to the rudder. If he provoked it, a single swipe of the tail would destroy the rudder, and they would be stranded. Chase hesitated. He lowered the lance. It was the fatal mistake. The whale turned. It swam away about 500 yards. Then it turned back. It faced the ship again. It began to beat its tail. It picked up speed. It was moving at 20 knots. A living battering ram of bone and muscle. It was creating a bow wave like a destroyer. "Here he is," Nickerson screamed. "He is making for us again." Chase stared in horror. He saw the massive white head, scarred and barnacled, coming for the port bow. The impact was cataclysmic. The whale struck the ship right under the cathead. It crushed the heavy oak planks like they were paper. It drove the bow of the ship backward. The Essex shuddered violently. The masts whipped back and forth. The whale disengaged. It swam under the ship one last time and disappeared into the deep. It had done its job. The Essex began to tip forward. The bow was underwater. "Abandon ship," Chase screamed. "Grab the water. Grab the bread." The men scrambled. They had minutes. They grabbed 2 compasses. They grabbed 2 quadrants, navigation tools. They grabbed chests of hardtack, bread. They grabbed a few turtles they had on deck for food. They lowered Chase's damaged boat into the water. They jumped in. They rowed away from the ship. They sat in the silence of the ocean and watched. Captain Pollard saw the mast of his ship disappear from the horizon. He turned his boat around. He rowed back. He saw the Essex lying on her side, half submerged. He saw Chase sitting in a small boat, pale and shaking. Pollard pulled his boat alongside Chase's. The captain looked at the first mate. His face was a mask of shock. "My God, Mr. Chase," Pollard asked. "What is the matter?" Chase looked at the sinking ship. He looked at the captain. "We have been stove by a whale," he replied. The Essex did not sink immediately. She was filled with oil, so she floated, waterlogged, just below the surface. The men climbed back onto the wreck. They scavenged what they could. They found 600 pounds of hardtack. That sounds like a lot, but for 20 men, it was nothing. They found 65 gallons of water. They found a few muskets and some powder. They found nails and wood to build up the sides of the whaleboats. They had 3 boats. Pollard's boat, Chase's boat, Joy's boat. 20 men. 7 in 2 boats, 6 in the other. They were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They pulled out the charts. They were saturated with water. Pollard did the math. They were at the equator. The nearest islands were the Marquesas and the Society Islands, Tahiti. They were about 1,200 miles to the west. With the trade winds behind them, they could reach Tahiti in 30 days. The natives there were rumored to be friendly. But Chase and Joy argued. "We have heard rumors," Chase said. "Rumors of cannibals in the Marquesas. Rumors of savages who eat men." It was a tragic irony. They were terrified of being eaten by cannibals, so they made a decision that would force them to become cannibals themselves. Chase proposed a different plan. "We should sail south," he said. "South to the trade winds, then east to the coast of South America." South America was 3,000 miles away. It was a suicide route. It meant sailing against the wind and currents for twice the distance. Pollard knew it was wrong. He was the captain. He knew the ocean. He knew they should go west. But once again, the aristocrat crumbled before the sheer force of Owen Chase's personality. "If you fear the savages," Pollard said quietly, "then we will go south." On November 22, 1820, they pushed away from the wreck of the Essex. They raised their tiny sails. They turned their backs on safety. And they sailed into the wasteland. The ocean is a desert. This is a cliché, but to the men of the Essex, it was a literal, physical truth. They were drifting in the hottest part of the world, directly under the equator. The sun was not a source of light. It was a physical weight. It hammered down on them for 12 hours a day. There was no shade. The boats were open. The men were cooking in their own skin. Captain Pollard established the rations: 6 ounces of hardtack bread per man per day. Half a pint of water. Half a pint is a cup of coffee. Try living on that when you're rowing a heavy boat in 100-degree heat. The physiology of thirst is brutal. First, the mouth goes dry. The saliva thickens into a glue. Then, the tongue swells. It fills the mouth, making speech impossible. The men began to communicate in grunts and hand signals. Then, the blood thickens. The heart has to pump harder to move the sludge through the veins. Finally, the brain begins to shrink. Hallucinations start. Owen Chase wrote in his journal, "Our sufferings were now great. The pangs of thirst were intolerable." They began to drink their own urine. It was a mistake. The salt content only accelerated the dehydration. They caught a few flying fish that landed in the boats and ate them raw, scales and all, just for the moisture in the blood. But the worst torture was the salt. The wind blew the spray of the ocean onto their clothes. The sun dried it into crystals. The crystals rubbed against their skin like sandpaper. They developed saltwater boils, festering sores that covered their legs and backs. To move was agony. And the boats were leaking. The attack by the whale had loosened the seams. The men had to bail constantly. If they stopped bailing to sleep, they woke up in water. For 30 days, they drifted. They were ghosts sailing in coffins. Nature wasn't done with them. One night, while they were drifting in the dark, a shape slammed into Chase's boat. It wasn't a sperm whale. It was smaller, faster. It was an orca, a killer whale. It rammed the stern. It bit the rudder. Chase grabbed a hatchet. He looked at the water. He saw the black and white demon circling for another pass. He struck the water with the hatchet. He screamed. The whale paused. It looked at them. Then, bored with the game, it swam away. The men were terrified. It felt personal. It felt like the ocean had declared war on them. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. On December 20th, 1820, 1 month since the sinking, Thomas Nickerson stood up in the boat. He rubbed his eyes. "Land," he croaked. "Land ho!" It was a miracle. A low, rocky island on the horizon. They rode with the last of their strength. They crashed onto the beach. They fell out of the boats. They crawled on the sand. They found a spring. It was down in a rocky crevice. They drank. They wept. They splashed the water on their sores. They thought they were saved. They thought this was Tahiti or the Pitcairn Islands. They were wrong. They had landed on Henderson Island. It is a limestone rock in the middle of nowhere. It is one of the most remote islands on Earth. It has no soil. It has no fruit trees. It has no wild pigs. It is a seabird colony. For the first few days, they feasted. They grabbed the nesting birds, boobies and tropic birds, right off their nests. They ate the eggs. They ate the crabs on the beach. But Henderson Island is a trap. Within a week, The birds learned fear. They moved their nests to the inaccessible cliffs. The crabs disappeared, and the water was tidal. The spring was below the high tide line. For 12 hours a day, it was covered by the ocean. They could only drink at low tide, and the spring was drying up. Captain Pollard looked at the island. He saw the truth. This wasn't salvation. It was a waiting room for death. If they stayed, they would eat everything on the island in a month, and then they would starve. "We have to leave," Pollard said. The men protested. Leave land? To go back to the boats? The boats were hell. The island was purgatory. They preferred purgatory. But Pollard was firm. This is not living. This is dying slowly. We must try for Easter Island. They began to prepare. They filled their water kegs. They gathered as many birds as they could carrying, but not everyone was willing to go. 3 men came to Pollard: Seth Weeks, William Wright, Thomas Chappell. They were not sailors from Nantucket. They were outsiders, men from Cape Cod and England who had joined the crew. "We are not going," Wright said. "We will take our chances here." Pollard looked at them. He didn't argue. He understood. The fear of the boats was absolute. "Very well," Pollard said. "We will leave you a few supplies." They left them a small cask of water, a few pounds of bread, and an axe. It was a death sentence, and they all knew it. On December 27th, the 17 remaining men got back into the 3 boats. They pushed off. They looked back at the beach. They saw the 3 men standing there. 3 tiny figures on a white beach, surrounded by 1 billion tons of ocean. They didn't wave. They just watched. Thomas Nickerson later wrote, "I never felt such a wrenching of the heart as when we turned our backs on them." The 3 men on Henderson Island watched the sails disappear. They were now the loneliest men on Earth. January 1821. The new year brought new horrors. The 3 boats, Pollard, Chase, and Joy, were sailing east, trying to reach Easter Island. But the navigation was wrong. They were too far south. The winds were pushing them away from the island. They missed it. Now, there was no target. There was only Chile, 2,000 miles away. The rations were cut again. 1 ounce of bread. A spoonful of water. Matthew Joy, the second mate, was the first to fall. He had been sickly before the voyage, probably tuberculosis. The exposure finished him. He died in the bottom of his boat. They sewed him into his clothes. They tied a stone to his feet. They pushed him overboard. There was no service, no prayer, just the splash. Joy's boat was given to a harpooner, Obed Hendricks. Now there were 3 boats, but one was leaderless. On the night of January 12th, a gale hit. It was pitch black. The rain was torrential. Chase's boat was separated from the others. Chase shouted into the dark, "Captain! Captain!" No answer. When the sun rose, the ocean was empty. Owen Chase was alone with his crew. Captain Pollard and Obed Hendricks were somewhere else, miles away. The separation broke the last psychological safety net. As long as the boats were together, they were a fleet. They were a society. Alone, they were just meat in a box. Let us focus on Owen Chase's boat. There were 5 men: Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, Thomas Nickerson, the boy, Isaac Cole, Richard Peterson. By mid-January, the food was gone. They were starving. Starvation is a specific madness. You dream of food. You talk about food. You smell roast beef in the salt air. Richard Peterson was a black man, an older sailor. He was the most religious man on the boat. He sang hymns every night. On January 18th, he stopped singing. He looked at Chase. "I am going," he whispered. He died an hour later. Now came the test. They had a dead body. They had no food. They knew what they should do. They knew what sailors whispered about in the taverns of Nantucket, the custom of the sea. But Owen Chase was a man of immense will. He refused. "We are Christians," he said. He ordered the body thrown overboard. They watched Peterson sink. They watched the sharks come. They regretted it instantly. The hunger came back, sharper than before. They had thrown away life. Miles away, in the other two boats, the situation was worse. Captain Pollard's boat and Hendrick's boat were still together, but barely. They had run out of food days ago. On January 20th, a man named Lawson Thomas died in Hendricks's boat. The men in Hendrick's boat didn't throw him overboard. They were too weak, and they were too hungry. They cut him up. They lit a fire on the flat stone they used for cooking in the bottom of the boat. They roasted the organs. They ate him. A few days later, Charles Shorter died in Pollard's boat. Pollard's crew did the same. They ate their shipmate. It wasn't savagery. It was surgery. They stripped the meat from the bones. They washed it in salt water. They ate it quickly, trying not to think about who it was. They were fueling the machine, but the meat ran out. On January 28th, another man died in Hendrick's boat. They ate him too. Then, on the night of January 29th, the two boats drifted apart. Pollard lost sight of Hendricks. Obed Hendricks and his boat, with 3 men left, drifted into the darkness. They were never seen again. Years later, a boat was found washed up on a remote island in the Pacific. Inside were 4 skeletons. It is believed to be them. Now, Captain Pollard was alone. There were 4 men in his boat: Pollard, Charles Ramsdell, Barzillai Ray, Samuel Reed. They had eaten the dead. But now, no one was dying fast enough. They were all dying at the same speed. They looked at each other. They saw the hunger in each other's eyes. They realized the terrible truth. If they waited for someone to die naturally, the meat would be wasted. The survivor would be too weak to eat. To survive, someone had to die before their time. Someone had to be sacrificed. On February 6th, Charles Ramsdell, a teenager, spoke the words. "Captain," he said, "we must draw lots." Pollard froze. This was the ultimate taboo, to kill a living man. But he looked at the others. They were skeletons wrapped in parchment. "My God," Pollard whispered. "Has it come to this?" He tried to offer himself. "Kill me," he said. "I am the captain. It is my fault." But Ramsdell refused. "No, we must follow the custom. It must be fair." They took a piece of paper. They tore it into 4 strips. One was shorter than the others. They put them in a hat. Captain Pollard held the hat. They drew. Pollard unfolded his slip. It was long. He was safe. Ramsdell drew. Long. Safe. Barzillai Ray drew. Long. Safe. The last slip belonged to Owen Coffin. Owen Coffin was 17 years old. He was Captain Pollard's first cousin. Before they left Nantucket, Pollard had promised Owen's mother, his own aunt, that he would protect the boy with his life. Pollard looked at the slip of paper in the boy's hand. He dropped the hat. "My lad," Pollard cried, "my lad, if you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man who touches you." He pulled out his pistol. He offered to take the boy's place. Owen Coffin looked at him. The boy was calm. He was almost relieved. The waiting was over. "I like it as well as any other," Coffin said softly. Then came the second drawing, the lottery of the executioner. Who would pull the trigger? They drew again. Charles Ramsdell drew the short straw. Ramsdell and Coffin were best friends. They had grown up together. Coffin rested his head on the gunwale of the boat. "Dispatch me quick, Charles," he said. Ramsdell raised the pistol. He was weeping. He pulled the trigger. The boy fell. Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell butchered the boy. They roasted him on the stone. They ate Owen Coffin. Pollard had eaten his cousin. He had broken his promise. He had survived, but he had lost his soul. In Owen Chase's boat, the situation had descended into a different kind of hell. They had not drawn lots. They had not killed anyone. But the specter of death was sitting on the thwart beside them. By February 8th, Isaac Cole, one of the toughest sailors on the ship, broke. It wasn't his body that gave out first, it was his mind. He began to shout. He demanded a napkin. He demanded water. He screamed that the ship was just over the horizon. He stood up in the boat, rocking it violently, trying to walk on the water. Chase and the others had to pin him down. They held him until his strength faded. He died in convulsions. Now, Owen Chase, Benjamin Lawrence, and the boy Thomas Nickerson were left with the body. They were starving. Their rations of bread were gone. They looked at Isaac Cole. They looked at the water where they had thrown Richard Peterson weeks ago. They remembered the regret. Chase made the decision. "We must eat," he said. They did not throw Isaac Cole overboard. They separated his limbs from his body. They removed the heart. They ate it raw. They cut the flesh into strips and hung it up to dry in the sun. For the next week, they lived on the dried flesh of their friend. But as they ate, something terrified them even more than the hunger: the fire. One night, Chase tried to cook a piece of meat. The fire got out of control. It nearly burned through the bottom of the boat. Imagine the irony. To be eaten by the ocean because you were trying to cook a man. By February 18th, the meat was gone. They were 3 skeletons floating in a void. They stopped talking. They stopped moving. They simply lay in the bottom of the boat and waited for the end. February 18th, 1821. Day 89. Thomas Nickerson was lying in the bow. He had pulled a piece of canvas over his head. He wanted to die in the dark. Benjamin Lawrence was standing up, trying to fix a piece of sail. Suddenly, Lawrence froze. He didn't shout. He didn't have the saliva to shout. He just pointed. Chase dragged himself up. He looked. A sail. A massive, beautiful, white sail. It was the brig Indian, out of London. It was only a few miles away. Chase grabbed the oars. "Pull," he croaked. "Pull for your lives." They rowed with a strength that defied biology. It was the adrenaline of resurrection. The Indian saw them. They hove to. The captain of the Indian looked over the rail. He saw a small battered whaleboat approaching. Inside were 3 creatures. They didn't look like men. Their skin was black with sores. Their hair was matted. Their eyes were sunken into skulls. And the bottom of their boat was covered in blood and bones. As they were pulled onto the deck, Thomas Nickerson collapsed. He tried to kneel to thank the captain, but his legs wouldn't work. He was given a teaspoon of tapioca and water. He wept. He was alive. 5 days later. February 23rd. 300 miles away, Captain Pollard and Charles Ramsdell were the last 2 left in their boat. They had eaten Owen Coffin. Then Barzillai Ray had died. They ate him, too. Now, they were gnawing on the bones. They were delirious. They were no longer conscious of who they were. They were just 2 animals in a wooden cage, guarding their food. A ship appeared. The whaleship Dauphin, out of Nantucket. They sailed close to the small boat. The crew of the Dauphin looked down in horror. They saw 2 piles of rags in the bottom of the boat. They saw the scattered bones cracked open for marrow. The captain of the Dauphin leaned over the rail. "Who are you?" he shouted. Captain Pollard looked up. He was clutching a bone. He blinked, confused by the noise. "We are the Essex," he whispered. They were hauled aboard. They were so protective of the bones that they tried to bring them onto the ship. They had to be gently disarmed. Pollard was safe. But the man who climbed onto that deck was not the same man who had left Nantucket. The survivors were taken to Valparaiso, Chile. Pollard, Ramsdell, Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson. 5 survivors from the boats. But there was unfinished business. Henderson Island. The 3 men who had chosen to stay behind. Weeks turned into months. The survivors in Chile assumed the men on the island were dead. It was a barren rock, but an Australian merchant ship, the Surrey, was dispatched to look for them. On April 9, 1821, 4 months after the Essex crew had left, the Surrey reached Henderson Island. They fired a gun, no answer. They rowed ashore. They saw footprints in the sand. Then, 3 scarecrows emerged from the caves: Seth Weeks, William Wright, and Thomas Chappell. They were alive. They had survived by drinking water that dripped from the ceiling of a cave. They had eaten shellfish and bird eggs. They had nearly gone mad from the isolation, but they had held on. 8 men, out of 20, 8 men had survived the wrath of the white whale. The return to Nantucket was not a celebration. It was a funeral procession. When the ship carrying Captain Pollard entered the harbor, the church bells did not ring. The crowd on the wharf was silent. Everyone knew. The rumors had traveled faster than the ships. They knew about the cannibalism. They knew about the lottery. Pollard walked down the gangplank. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He walked with his head down. He was looking for one face, or rather, hiding from it. Nancy Coffin, his aunt, the mother of the boy he had shot and eaten. She was there. She looked at him. Pollard tried to speak. He tried to explain the lottery, the starvation, the promise he tried to keep. She didn't scream. She didn't strike him. She simply turned her back. She never spoke to him again. Owen Chase arrived separately. He was reunited with his wife. He met a daughter he had never seen. She was born while he was at sea. He tried to return to normal life. He tried to be a hero. He wrote a book about the disaster, narrative of the most extraordinary and distressing shipwreck of the whaleship Essex. It was a bestseller. But the ink on the pages couldn't cover the stain on his memory. Survival has a price, and the bill comes due in the silence of old age. Thomas Nickerson, the boy, went back to sea. He became a captain of the merchant marine. He eventually settled in Brooklyn and ran a boarding house. He wrote his own account of the disaster late in life, but he hid the manuscript. It wasn't found until 1980. He wanted to forget the taste of human flesh. Owen Chase became a successful whaling captain, but the trauma rotted him from the inside. In his old age, he began to hoard food. He would hide bread in the attic of his house. He would cry if he didn't have food in his pockets. He was declared insane. He spent his final years staring at the wall, terrified that he would starve. And Captain George Pollard, the aristocrat, he was given a second chance. The owners of the Essex gave him a new ship, the Two Brothers. 2 years later, he wrecked it on a coral reef. He was cursed. No one would hire him again. "I am a man who brings bad luck," he said. He spent the rest of his life on Nantucket as the night watchman. Every night, for decades, he walked the dark streets of the town, lighting the lamps with whale oil. The man who had eaten his cousin to survive was now the man who kept the lights on for others. 30 years later, 1852, a young writer named Herman Melville visited Nantucket. He was writing a book about a white whale. He wanted to meet the man who had lived it. He found George Pollard. He was an old man now, humble and quiet. They sat together. Pollard told him the story. He told him about the whale that fought back. He told him about the lottery. Melville was awestruck. He later wrote, "To the islanders he was a nobody. To me, the most impressive man, the wholly humble, uncomplaining, an unpretending hero. Melville published Moby Dick. It was a failure. It didn't sell. Pollard died without knowing that his nightmare had inspired the greatest work of American literature. The story of the Essex is more than an adventure. It is a mirror. We like to think of ourselves as civilized. We have laws. We have morals. We have lines we will not cross. But the Essex teaches us that those lines are drawn in sand. And when the tide of hunger comes in, the lines wash away. Owen Chase, George Pollard, and the others were not monsters. They were men. Ordinary men pushed to the absolute limit of biological endurance. They looked into the abyss, and the abyss looked back. They survived the whale. They survived the ocean. But they could never survive the memory of what they had to do to live. In the end, the ocean kept its secrets. The white whale swam away, scarred but alive, vanishing into the deep blue. A reminder that in the war against nature, nature always wins. For 2 centuries, the central question of the Essex disaster has been, why? Whales are generally peaceful leviathans. They flee from danger. For a whale to turn, calculate, and ram a ship twice suggests a level of intention that terrified 19th century sailors. It suggested that nature was angry. But modern marine biology offers a different explanation. Sperm whales, Physeter macrocephalus, are the loudest animals on Earth. Their click, used for echolocation, can be 230 decibels. That is louder than a jet engine at takeoff. It is loud enough to vibrate a human body to death if you are swimming next to it. On the day of the attack, Owen Chase was repairing a whaleboat on the deck. He was hammering, clang, clang, clang. To a submerged sperm whale, that sound travels for miles. It sounds rhythmic. It sounds percussive. It sounds like another male. Bull sperm whales fight for dominance. They slam their heads, which are filled with spermaceti oil, acting as a shock absorber, into each other. The science suggests that the white whale didn't know what a ship was. He heard the hammering. He saw a dark shape on the surface roughly the size of a rival male. He interpreted the Essex not as a vessel of humans, but as a biological competitor encroaching on his territory. He wasn't fighting humanity. He was fighting a phantom rival. And he won. He proved that the shock absorber in his head was stronger than the oak planks of Nantucket craftsmanship. For 190 years, the physical evidence of Captain Pollard's bad luck was lost to history. We knew he wrecked his second ship, the Two Brothers, but we didn't know where. Pollard was considered a Jonah, a cursed sailor. After the Essex, he was given the Two Brothers. In 1823, he sailed her to the French frigate Shoals in Hawaii. A storm hit. The ship struck a reef. This time, there was no cannibalism, no long drift. They were rescued the next morning by another whaler, but the ship and Pollard's career sank to the bottom. In 2011, a team of NOAA maritime archaeologists were diving in the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii. They found something. First, they found a massive anchor. Then, 3 tripods, the iron cauldrons used to boil oil. Then, a harpoon tip. They identified it. It was the Two Brothers. It is the only discovery of a sunken Nantucket whaler in deep water. When the archaeologists brought the artifacts to the surface, it was a moment of profound connection. They were touching the iron that George Pollard touched. The wreck tells the story of the end of an era. Pollard wasn't a bad captain. He was navigating uncharted waters with primitive tools. The discovery of the Two Brothers rehabilitated his reputation from cursed fool to a man simply overwhelmed by the hazards of a dangerous trade. Herman Melville didn't just write Moby Dick out of thin air. He was obsessed with the Essex. Years after the book was published, a copy of Owen Chase's narrative was found in Melville's library. It is filled with handwritten notes in the margins. Melville analyzed Chase's mind. Where Chase wrote about the mysterious nature of the whale, Melville underlined it. Where Chase wrote about the madness of the hunger, Melville wrote notes about the human condition. But there is a key difference between the reality and the novel. In Moby Dick, Captain Ahab is a man fueled by hate. He chases the whale. He wants revenge. In the true story of the Essex, Captain Pollard was a man fueled by duty. He didn't chase the whale chased him. Melville turned a survival story into a revenge tragedy. But the reality of the Essex is arguably more frightening. Ahab chose his fate. Pollard and Chase had their fate thrust upon them by a universe that simply didn't care if they lived or died. The Essex disaster also forced the world to confront the legal and moral reality of survival cannibalism. At the time, the custom of the sea was an unwritten law. It stated that if sailors were stranded and starving, they could draw lots to see who would die so that the others might live. It was horrifying, but it was accepted. However, as civilization advanced, this law was challenged. Decades later, in the famous case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens, a similar case of shipwreck cannibalism, the British courts ruled that necessity is no defense for murder. If the Essex happened today, Captain Pollard would be put on trial. He would be analyzed by psychiatrists. The media would tear him apart. But in 1820 on Nantucket, there was no trial. There was only a quiet Quaker understanding. The families of the dead boys, Owen Coffin, Charles Shorter, Samuel Reed, lived down the street from the men who ate them. They saw them at the market. They saw them at church. Nantucket chose silence. They chose to believe that what happens on the ocean stays on the ocean. It was a collective trauma that the island buried, just as they buried the empty coffins of the lost men. So, why does the story of the Essex still grip us 200 years later? It isn't just the gore. It isn't just the white whale. It is because it strips away the illusion of control. We build our ships. We build our technology. We map the stars. We think we have conquered the wild. But the Essex reminds us that we are small. We are biological machines that require water and protein. And when those are taken away, our morality dissolves. Owen Chase, the ambitious first mate, died a hoarder, terrified of the dark. George Pollard, the noble captain, died a night watchman, humble and broken. Thomas Nickerson, the innocent boy, spent his life trying to forget the taste of his friends. They were the astronauts of their day, venturing into the deep unknown, and they found out that in the deep unknown there are monsters. But the scariest monster wasn't the whale. The scariest monster was in the boat. As you look out at the ocean today, at the calm blue water, remember the Essex. Remember that beneath the surface, the Leviathan is waiting. And remember that inside every civilized man, there is a starving survivor waiting for the lights to go out.